which I then canceled, but then I just decided, okay, I've got to, I've got to work on it. But if you don't have that capability, or if you don't have access to the internet, you aren't getting a shot. And I guess in New York, they're saying if you're over 75, they allow you to call by phone. But other than that, yeah. Even in Florida, where they had more doses, they've been canceled. But then what they did was you have to log in at it was like 6 a.m. Now they changed it to 7, and it's the public's, grocery store. And then you see all the counties, and you just wait till they let you in. And twice I waited, and they let me in when all the slots were gone, except for some place was like 400 miles from, where my apartment is. So, but anyway, and I had a little bit of reaction, not too bad, sore arm, but really, feeling just unwell, but, just lasted for about 2 days, and now I feel better.
Well, that means it's working.
Have you gotten your first one, or you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
With the first, waiting for the second next week, next Monday.
Yeah. Did you get the Pfizer or the Moderna? Yeah, I got the Pfizer. So. Anyway, it's a very
Madam Co-Chair.
Hello, President Freiberga.
Hello. I think you're talking vaccinations, are you?
Yeah. We were talking about if you're not good, at least in the US, if you don't have access to the internet, or you're not good with being persistent, it's very difficult to get an appointment.
We do have an internet site that was opened up for people signing up. Because I was just talking to the head of a private clinic which has the best diagnostics in Latvia yesterday, and he said that they have the first set of vaccines was for medical personnel. Yeah. So a clinic that does both therapeutics and also diagnostics for state supported medical services. They wanted to vaccinate everybody, but it's voluntary. There's no law that makes it compulsive. And many of the cleaning staff are ethnic Russians who listen to Russian television. And they say that President Putin told them that all the Western vaccines are no good, and only Sputnik is any good. And therefore they have refused to be vaccinated, and they're waiting for their dose of Sputnik to arrive. But in the meantime, everybody else is vaccinated in the clinic, and they're walking around, I guess, with masks on. But it's kind of naturally, for whatever reasons, if somebody refuses, I don't suppose anybody has a law making it compulsory to be vaccinated.
I don't think, at least not in the US. I don't know about other countries like in China, if it's compulsory. I don't know. But it does show, I guess to me, not exactly, but, one of the things that is a concern in the US, which is more if you don't have access to the internet, or if you're not savvy in this way, which is usually people who are poor, it would be very difficult to get a vaccine, and you have to be persistent as well.
But the anti-vaccine movement in Latvia, there's various currents in it. One of them is that Bill Gates wants to chip people so that he can influence them in the future. So the joke running in Latvia is the following: seeing the great secrets that we as a great nation are carrying, you see, of world import, what Bill Gates must be interested in is every Latvian's secret place where he can find the best mushrooms in the fall. Because I couldn't think of anything else that would be of value enough to Bill Gates to have us chipped.
But Madam, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the first person they vaccinated was somebody who was in their 90s in Britain. And the first thing they said is, I wonder what Bill Gates wants to find out from that person.
Yeah. There you are. We have our favorite mushroom places, you see.
Hello.
Hi there. How are you?
Very
Good
well.
morning. Good afternoon. Hello.
But, Madam President, when you were talking about the ethnic Russians waiting for the Sputnik vaccine, how do they intend to get it? I mean, do they intend to go to Russia or? Yeah, it's very.
I don't know. Because what the government, we have all 3 vaccines. By the way, we're, I think, the second worst in Europe in terms of getting the supplies of vaccines. They're very low in Latvia for there's various reasons. It's rather pathetic as a situation. Very few available and very few vaccinated so far, compared, say, to Britain or never mind Israel. Israel is way ahead of everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've gotten to 100% almost, or close to it.
No, they haven't. But it's not helping.
No?
No,
They're getting vaccinated, but the numbers are still high.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's bad news.
Yeah.
That's bad news.
well, do people feel if they're vaccinated, then, they're free not to take any other kind of precautions? Yeah,
They're free to gallivant, right?
yeah.
Well, if I could say, the one thing we felt here in Ukraine is that even though we're not going to have vaccines for a long time, my doctor said not earlier than this summer, is that we can get tested very easily. But a classmate of mine from the United States said that he needed a test to be able to fly to a funeral in Phoenix, Arizona, and he was not able to schedule a test for 3 days.
Yeah.
And so when I hear things like that, I'm stunned. Because at least if we do nothing else, we do our testing right here.
Probably easier to get a vaccine today than to get tested. We really screwed that up royally.
Yeah, I agree. It was easier before. I've been tested several times, like before I traveled, but now even in New York, it's difficult to get a test. It should be just matter of fact, but it's not.
Do we have anybody to steer
We
the
start.
meeting?
Oh, shall we start?
I think
I
so.
think, Zlatko, we should be starting, right? Will you be sharing?
If Vaira if you say that we are starting, then we are starting. Your word is my command, right? I'm using. I don't know. You're more.
Zlatko, I think you should start.
You're one of my multiple presidents. I mean, so I'm used on waiting for you to tell me when to start. So we can.
Command.
Okay, go. So lift off. Now, thank you very much, Vaira, and here we are. For some of you who maybe don't know me, I'm Zlatko Lagumdzija. I'm known as Vaira's friend in Southeastern Europe, in Bosnia more in particular, and someone who is very much working together with Roshan, who I want to thank in advance, because he's the one who's always making us to convene like this in such a good company and having topics that we all enjoy in. At least I have been enjoying in events like this. This is our second event today that we have as a part of our web NGIC web conference, Beyond the Pandemic, the Evolving World System and Future of Democracy. The first panel we had this morning was with our dear friends and very distinguished group of people, which I may say later on. I mean, by the time we come to the end and concluding this, it was about how we can strengthen the international multilateral system and free from the bureaucratic shackles that impede its action. It was a very good discussion, and I'm absolutely sure that this one is going to be even more enjoyable and fruitful. So today, now the second panel that we are having is about practically Whither democracy. Where do we go as democracy? And this idea for this event and this gathering and this very particular topic came out from President Vike-Freiberga in one of our previous meetings on the board of NGIC, where President Vike-Freiberga initiated that we have this as a topic, having in mind what we are entering into. Without further introductions, I will call Jeffrey, Jeffrey Sachs, dear friend, to lift off with our first statement and what we very well did this morning. We started with the statements. I said 3 to 4 minutes, but I mean, that's the reason why everyone ended in 5 minutes, in order to have second and third round of discussions where we practically said everything which we would say in the first intervention if we were talking for 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm asking you to slice your prepared statements in a little bit more discussion so we can have some kind of interaction. Without further notice and without mentioning all of you by name, because obviously the discussion we had before about pandemic, about vaccination shows how big family and how family we are. By the way, Nizami Ganjavi year is now pronounced and named this year to be Nizami Ganjavi year in Azerbaijan and by NGIC, because this is the 88th decade of Nizami Ganjavi. Today we figured out that he was born in 12th century, and his philosophy, his values, and what he was promoting and preaching and thinking about, which our NGIC is based on, philosophy based on dialogue, tolerance, learning, and understanding. He defined those 4 words in 12th century. And I figured out today the 12th century, when you look 1, 2, in the mirror, it's 21. So it's kind of strange that that guy back in 12th century actually mirrored what we are going to need in 21st century. So thank you very much. And Jeffrey, the screen is yours, hoping that very soon we will be able to tell you the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zlatko, and dear friends. Good to be with everybody and to see you. I think I will just put 3 themes on the table. The first is that democracies throughout human history have been fragile creations, and they have depended on avoiding collapse because of social divisions. And this goes back to Solon in ancient Greece, and it carries forward to today. The United States is a profoundly wounded democracy. It's even ranked as a semi-democracy by the by the Economic Intelligence Unit rankings. Trump was a psychopathic authoritarian figure, and we came very close to utter disaster because he had a very large following. So it behooves us to understand this. We're not the first to experience this kind of crisis, but we need to understand it better. America has always been 2 countries, a country of openness and diversity, and a country of white supremacist racism. And those 2 countries have competed with each other throughout American history. We had a civil war because of that. We had an apartheid economic system for 100 years after the Civil War. And it's only since the 1950s, and especially the 1960s, that we are dismantling apartheid. But it's fragile. And Trump was a president of the white supremacist remaining part of the country. I believe that it's in demographic decline and moral decline, but it still remains powerful. And we came perilously close to disaster just a few weeks ago. We have an impeachment trial today because of that, where most Republicans will vote with Trump because their base tells them to. So America's very wounded, and it is this peculiar mix of ideals and absolute social division, and this is our struggle that remains. It's true of many other democracies, which are riven by class, ethnicity, race, income, geography, and other dimensions. And I think this is the great peril to democracies. Second theme that I would put on the table is capacity of any of our governments, but also democratic governments, to take on longer-term challenges. We face major issues like climate change and environmental destruction, and short-term politicians. And so this capacity issue is a very serious one. We don't have a planning capacity in the United States government, for example, other than in the Pentagon. We don't have a civilian planning capacity. And therefore, it's like an organism without its head. So it's very reactive, very short-term, very incapable of long-term action. And the third point that I would put on the table is geopolitics. America is a very particular country in the way that Britain was before, the only two hegemonic powers of the last 200 years. It leads to a kind of arrogance, a sense of right and dominance, and a almost desire for a fight. So Trump was trying to instigate a new fight with China for absolutely no reason, in my opinion, though China has many problems, and it is obviously not a democracy. We don't need a geopolitical struggle. We need an open process where we try to find shared values. But the more that there is international tension, the worse democracies perform. War is a destroyer of democracy. Security states are destroyers of democracy. Having a permanent military-industrial complex profoundly undermines the United States democracy. It's made us a country of secrecy and lies in foreign policy. So all of this is to say, none of our countries is performing very well these days. No democracy did a good job in responding to COVID-19, except for Australia and New Zealand, I think. I wouldn't rate any other country very high in this. We've been unable to take serious measures and serious actions. Democracies have not done well on inequality. They've not done well on climate change. And they have basically all, to a varying extent, been increasingly divided by class and often by ethnicity. And so I'll stop there, pass it back to you, Zlatko. This is a fragile time for our institutions. I don't have an easy remedy within 5 minutes. Just I'll put the problems on the table.
Oh, thank you, Jeffrey. This morning, I mean, we ended, among other things, we were talking about on our first panel. We agreed, basically speaking, that this is some kind of new beginning, like it was after World War II. Or if we can say after Black Plague, if we want to go further in history, we have to open the process of Renaissance, a new Renaissance time, like after Black Plague, or to do something which was opened back after World War II, when UN was established, with Bretton Woods institutions were established, and when the focus was basically speaking on well-being, on human well-being. Now we have to start again, like in those two periods, comparatively speaking. And in that sense, I think that everyone agrees that epidemic health is the primary issue, and it will continue, especially with this evolution of the virus, and who knows in what direction. Second is environmental. We agree that environmental issues is second one, before economics. Economy is the third thing, because environmental has to be tackled through actually sustainable economy. And of course, the third thing was economy, and economy, especially we were worried about uneven recovery of developed and middle emerging and especially undeveloped countries. And the fourth area was technology, basically speaking. A lot of things can be done through technology, and technologies, and especially artificial intelligence, are opening new threats and new opportunities. And finally, which we all agree on, which is below the radar, and we have to put it higher and higher, which is education. And here I stop. So that's what we identify as the 5 key areas. And I'm sure that I practically took away from Vaira some of her lines. by wrapping up what we concluded this morning. President Vike-Freiberga, please, would you take a screen?
Thank you very much for all of you for participating in this debate, because I think it has been evident to all of us here and to many others that democracy, even in places where we had thought that it had age-long and very solid roots, is still a fragile flower and very much under threat from a variety of sources. And when I look around the world and to see what are the drivers of anti-democratic movements, the rather scary thing is that they are not of a simple identifiable kind where you could say, aha, let's say economic inequality is the problem, and then therefore we concentrate on economic development, and when a country reaches a certain level of income, we can be assured that it will have an average democratic level as well. It turns out it is not so simple at all, although naturally it is obvious that certainly in the United States, the crisis of 2008-2009 played a role in disenfranchising a large proportion of the population, I think, who feel threatened. Few countries, developed countries, rich countries, can claim to have so many people who are threatened with being laid out, dispossessed of their place of residence because they're unable to keep up mortgage payments. Even in a small country like Latvia, we have the government has issued rules whereby banks and lenders and so on have to give periods of grace to accept reduced rents and so on. Whereas from what I hear, I'm not perfectly well informed, but I get the impression that there are numbers of people threatened with dispossession and being laid out on the street. And that, of course, is reason for discontent. But when we look at discontent elsewhere, in Russia, it is the treatment of dissidents and the police brutality of unprecedented scale. In Belarus, it is a discontent with the results of the elections, but in a quite different way from the discontent in America. I think when you compare the situation in Belarus and the situation in the United States, where you do have claims of elections having been stolen from the electorate, both the facts on the ground, such as we have them, and the reasons for people going out on the street, and the manner in which it's done, interestingly enough, are different. In an autocracy like Belarus, these have been peaceful demonstrations, and all the violence has been on the part of the repressive, the OMON units, the special units, and the security forces of the president and the general police forces. In the United States, it was mob rule, it was mob violence. And when I look at the recent breakdown of the relatively small proportion of people who have been already accused and prosecuted, and the demographics of these people, it is increasingly scary for the sense of a deep democracy, because they are not a single profile or even 2-3 profile people. There's a broad range of professions represented. They are not young people. There are a lot of people 40 and 50 years old. They come from all parts of the country. It's not the old South and the Confederate flags asking to go back to slavery or to official racism. You have former people with Purple Hearts from the military, presumably also policemen who are the guardians of civil order in the country. Doctors who, granted, have been promoting anti-vaccine movements, and so you might say they have marginal ideas within their profession, but they are equally violent about attacking and believing that there has been massive electoral fraud. And when you think that Trump has millions of supporters, and that the Republican Party is actually sort of dangling by a thread in terms of its unity between those who would wish to follow certain principles and who still believe that the party has a moral, if you like, compass that it wishes to follow, and others who are absolutely ready to go with the populist movements, whatever their nature, simply because they know that if they pander to the wishes of Trump supporters, they will find an electorate that will help them to be re-elected. And that is the part that, to me, as somebody whose country's security in many ways depends on the foreign policy of the United States of America, I find that extremely alarming. But these are not the only reasons. In other countries, Poland, women are going in the streets, and it's why. It's because there is a movement to bring back authoritarian church rule over civic rule in the country. In Latvia, we had all confessions jointly addressing the government about not ratifying this Istanbul Convention because it included not just violence against women, but also transgender issues. And all the churches in Latvia, the Christian churches, mind you, but about 4 different confessions, have approached the government by saying that the moral authority of the church simply cannot accept some of the provisions that the Istanbul Convention guarantees to people. And a few days ago, as a guest at the opening of a new working year for our constitutional court in Latvia, in a speech I made, I pointed out that the if you like, the moral leadership of the church is something that pertains to the freedom of conscience and freedom of worship. That is an accepted part of democracy, but that it also goes back not to the bloody part of the French Revolution, where the anti-clericalism was obviously extreme, but to the Enlightenment ideas of a civic moral responsibility and a civic rule of law in a country based on rationalist and Enlightenment ideas, and an inclusivity of citizens where you do not impose the criteria of one faith on the believers of another, and hence you have separation of church and state. Of course, you have Britain, which is supposed to be a democracy, but the king or the queen is the head, since Henry VIII is the head of the church. And a great deal of tragedy in the royal family actually goes back to the fact that they are supposed to be also the moral authority of the country. This is not the case in most other democratic countries, where separation of church and state is an essential part of definitions of democracy. Think of the theocracy of Iran, a theocracy that is, it measures up to the Europe of the Middle Ages and the South American colonies when the Inquisition was at the height of its powers. So that both the idea of what it means to have human rights as an individual, the idea of the rule of law and how it applies both to individuals and to groups and sectors of society, all of these are being challenged in one way or another in different countries and in different ways. I'm thinking of Myanmar and the relationship of Aung San Suu Kyi with the Western world. She got the Nobel Peace Prize. Universities and streets and institutes were named in her name. The Club de Madrid voted her an honorary member, and so forth. A few years ago, she went to the International Criminal Court in The Hague and defended the military government and its treatment of the Rohingya and refusing to admit that this was an example of deliberate genocide. Presumably, she did it in order to introduce some more democratic reforms in her country, but more cynical voices have said that she did it to pander to the prejudices of the Buddhist majority of Myanmar. And indeed, her popularity and the number of seats her party got in November 2020 elections was even greater than from 5 years before. So that in terms of objective support for that thesis, there is some objective support. Altogether, and here's an icon of sort of embodying a desire for equity and righteousness and equal rights in a country. And she is a fallen idol, I think, in the eyes of many at this moment, even though those whom she protected when she went to The Hague and addressed the ICC have now again turned against her because she was not supportive enough of an authoritarian system. Altogether, what worries me the most about the fragility of democracy is the variety of ways it is being attacked and the variety of arguments that we hear against it. So we don't have a single front where all our armies and all our thoughts and our efforts can be said, well, let's work on this and we will improve things. We have half a dozen different areas where work needs to be done. But I guess, well, it just will take more people and the fight will take longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaira. Jeffrey, Roshan warned me that you are not going to another meeting, but you are going to another screen. So before you go to another screen, please, I would like you to just reflect of what Vaira was saying and basically what you mentioned as a fragility of democracy. You just started with it at about wounded democracy. So my question to you is very simple, which relates to what we are discussing this morning as well. Economy is not everything, but without economy, a lot of things are not possible. And mostly the things that we are talking about. I mean, we are now confronted with the two challenges that we were seeing as a major economic problems at this moment, which are jeopardizing overall social fabrics. One is uneven and unequal global recovery that is on the horizon. And second one is growing inequality. With growing inequality, I mean, you know very well that, for example, 10 richest people just recently were named that during pandemic, they earned more money that is needed for overall hunger crisis in the last year and overall vaccination of population all over the world. At the same time, when it comes to an equal recovery, economic recovery, we are seeing that developed countries were averaging, putting in last year about 13% of their GDP for direct interventions in the business and about 12% in soft loans and basically speaking, loans of that were, so 25% of GDP was invested in developed countries. In developing countries, that those figures are significantly lower. They go like 4 plus 3%, and in poor countries, there's practically no loans. There is only about 1 up to 2% of GDP invested in some kind of subsidies during this pandemic. And it doesn't look like this is, some people are saying that vaccine is unevenly in a time and spectrum distributed in front of us, and the same applies to economy. So what we can expect and what we should do, especially in this year, we have those 3 major gatherings, one in biodiversity in coming China in May, the second one is sometimes in September in UN headquarters about food system, and finally the third one, which we all expect so much about on climate change in Glasgow in November. So could you just do some wrapping up of these issues before you take another screen?
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's nothing in a market economic system that by itself promotes an equal or just distribution of income. Market economies are intrinsically unequal in their impacts, and there are tendencies for widening inequalities of both income and wealth. So that reality has been debated for approximately 200 years pretty actively. And the lesson that we have overwhelmingly is that one must combine a market system with a social democratic ethos that involves considerable taxation and distribution of those tax funds for universal access to basic needs. Of all of the ideological debates from Proudhon and Marx onward, the system that has proven itself consistently to be a friend of human rights, human dignity, and narrowing inequality has been a social democratic ethos. And that is that we don't regard the market distribution of income as the just distribution. We regard it as a basis for efficiency, perhaps for growth, for wealth, but not for the access to needs. So healthcare, education, infrastructure are for everybody, not for those who happen to, for whatever reason, earn a higher return. This tendency towards inequality is strongly related to technological change, because from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, improved capital technologies displaced workers. First, it was weavers, and it was tenant farmers. Now, then in the last 40 years, it's been assembly line workers who are displaced by robots. So this is a core part of what economic advance actually is mechanization. It is higher output, but with strong inequalities of result. And the idea is that a just society brings everybody along. It's not true, as President Kennedy famously in our country said 60 years ago, that a rising tide lifts all boats. It doesn't. Many people don't have boats. A rising tide sinks a lot of people. And therefore, you need that kind of social democratic ethos. Inequality is widening now because of the acceleration of the digital economy. It's not only having access, but if you happen to own a portal like Mr. Bezos, you're suddenly worth $200 billion, which is unthinkable and obscene from a social justice point of view, but is a reflection of the fact that Amazon is a pervasive service that happens to give all the income to one person in the end. And now it should, he should be the first to say, I don't need more than $1 billion. You can take back the other 199 billion and use it for the social good. He hasn't said that yet. We might think about taxing that instead, which is the other way to do it. But the point of the matter is, in the United States, the oligarchs buy the politicians, so nobody thinks in these terms almost at all. And this is a serious, serious problem. So the point is, the inequality is growing. Now, the international side is no different. If we were a just global society, we would have social democracy at the global scale. We would recognize universal rights to health, education, and so forth, as we proposed to do in the Universal Declaration in 1948, and we would fund them. We would fund them globally, because poor countries can't fund them adequately locally, and we wouldn't have a big fight about it. But I've been in a strange situation for my 41 years as a practicing professional economist, which is that if you say within a society, we should have taxes of 30 or 40 or 50% of GDP, you can make the argument. But if you say internationally, we should transfer even 1% of the income of rich countries to poor countries, you're viewed as a fool. And I've spent decades trying to mobilize a fraction of 1% of GDP from rich countries for poor countries, and been derided, been viewed as outside of the economics norms? Don't you understand budget constraints, Mr. Sachs? So there's no sense of social democracy across international borders. Europe had a breakthrough this year when it agreed on a fund for recovery that actually has transfers within it. This was a big breakthrough for Europe. But isn't it amazing? Europe is the most sophisticated social democratic society on the planet by far. And yet within the European Union, you can't get a budget of more than 1% of GDP of the European Union to do European-wide activities. And when Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, put on the table this fund, which was a great breakthrough, who were the resistors? Denmark, Sweden, the so-called frugal four. Unbelievable. Those countries understand social democracy. They exemplify it. But the idea that there should be transfers across the countries was politically beyond what even the social democratic governments could take. That's within Europe. Now think about internationally. How do we get solidarity across countries? When it's so easy in my racist country, for example, every time I've tried to argue for aid for Africa in the last 40 years, you can imagine the earful that I've heard. So this is not an easy challenge, Zlatko. There's nothing in the international market system which guarantees economic justice. There's nothing within a national system which guarantees economic justice. Every smart philosophy of economics combines markets with redistribution and with universal rights to basic economic goods. And that should be done globally, and it should be done within countries, and it should be done within regions like the European Union as well. Now, final point, just to put a few numbers on the table, the entire development assistance of the rich countries for the poor countries is 0.3 of 1% of the income of the rich countries. It could hardly be lower and still appear on a page. We can't even mobilize in a decent world 1%, much less tithing our income, much less saying, let's end poverty. Any of those goals have eluded us until now. And I've begged for decades for a few billion here and there for, now I'm begging for vaccine funding and so on. Let me put it this way. The US is about to vote a $1.9 trillion package. It voted a $2.1 trillion package last March. It voted $900 billion in December. It will now vote a $1.9 trillion package now, $5 trillion without a budget line for the rest of the world on any of it. Not a budget line at all. It doesn't even dawn on the politicians to ask the question, if we're giving 1.9 trillion for ourselves, should we leave 50 billion for the rest of the world? No! How could we do that? We're in need. We're in desperate situation. How could you talk about that? That's un-American. So this is the kind of mindset that we have, not even to say automatically, set aside 1%, 2% for the other 96% of the world or the 50% in developing countries. We don't have that idea. We should come out of this period with a renewed commitment to international solidaristic financing. The last time we had anything like that was, as you pointed out, at the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, which established the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the IMF, and then a series of regional development banks that were established in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Then the United States lost interest in doing anything like that. Most countries never had interest in doing anything like that. We've spent most of our recent time telling China, don't you dare give aid. We're not giving it, so you don't give it, and saying how horrible it is when they give it. So why don't we all stop giving it, rather than saying, why don't we all improve? And in truth, we ought to come out of this period saying, we have agreed that we need to stop pandemics. We need to decarbonize the world energy system. We need to have all our children in school. We need to have access to basic healthcare. These are not only sustainable development goals, they were established in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now we need a funding model to do that. And I believe we should call on the United Nations to put forward a realistic financing model so that our goals can be paid for, and so that human dignity can be guaranteed everywhere, and that's a core lesson of this pandemic. We should not be begging for immunization funding right now. 1 year into this, we should not be begging when, even for the rich countries in the most narrow self-interested sense, it's vital to get immunizations to stop these new variant mutation spreads. Even in the most narrow sense, we still don't have that. I'm trying, by the way, these days, I'm working with the leadership of the IMF and others to try to use part of a new SDR allocation for funding COVAX, for funding the vaccine coverage, because we could create reserves that directly go to vaccine coverage so we don't have to beg country by country. And this is something we certainly should do. And I think there's actually a chance that we'll get that done in the next couple of weeks. So that's a goal. But more generally, if we could come out of this period in analogy to 1945, to say we need international financing for sustainable development. That means for human dignity, for social inclusion, and for environmental sustainability. And we don't have it honestly now. And we want to see the numbers, not just the rhetoric, but the bottom line of where it's going to come from and how it's going to go. And we can't have promises like $100 billion a year for climate for developing countries, 12 years old and still not made. That would be a good call to action. I'll give you just one tidbit. After Hillary Clinton's statement in Copenhagen in 2009 about the commitment of rich countries to fund poor countries, $100 billion a year for climate investment, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon established a commission on this. The role of the US on the commission was to make sure that there were no specifics put in, literally, because Obama was very afraid what's going to happen. We won't reach the Paris Agreement if the American people see that there's a charge to them for this. And so a commission met and no numbers were established. That was 2012, 2013. We're now 2021. They're still searching for the 100 billion. And this is in a world of 100 trillion GDP. So we're talking about 1.1 of 1% of world income per year. So that's where we are.
Wow, Jeffrey, thank you. I mean, now Professor Weizsacker, I mean, now you should just grab the ball from here and hopefully be more optimistic than Jeffrey, because after all, your Club of Rome tenure, I mean, and the Club of Rome for us, old economists and old like Jeffrey and myself are. Club of Rome was the beacon of progressive thinking of their time. So as a progressive thinker, grab the ball and please go give us some light.
Okay, we'll be very brief. One thing is evidently that in a civilization in which selfishness is considered one of the most important features of humans, and it's praised all over the place, how can you expect anything but selfishness? So that's part of the anthropological side. But the Club of Rome has been concerned with the limits to growth since 50 years or so. And this is, of course, a different avenue, a different question. And also here, the question of equity, of sharing, etc., will play a role. The old Club of Rome ideas were not very convincing, I must say. I mean, one thing was the mathematics. The formula established by J. Forrester was essentially that you have 5 parameters, each linking to the other 5 in constant parameters, which is completely absurd. I mean, for instance, they had a fixed relation between industrial output and pollution. This was prior to the Clean Air Act in America and all that. So the mathematics was very poor, I must say. Still, the message was correct, that for a limited planet, unlimited growth doesn't work. But for living with less growth, you need a system and understanding and conviction of sharing. Otherwise, it's not working. In that regard, my late friend Anil Agarwal in India and others had proposed the idea that each person on the world has the same right of using the atmosphere, using natural goods, etc. And a little later, the German Council for Global Environmental Change came up for the Copenhagen climate agreement, or climate meeting, with the so-called budget approach, which says that indeed all countries have the same per capita right or permit for using the atmosphere, but the old industrialized countries have more or less eaten up all their budget. And they would have to go shopping to developing countries asking for new permits. And that was a very clever idea. It would induce countries like India or Uruguay or Cameroon or so to direct their growth perspectives from burning ever more coal to selling some of the permits to the rich. And all of a sudden, it would be lucrative for India to stop coal burning, you know? That's not the case now. Unfortunately, in Copenhagen, Mrs. Merkel proposed this idea, but then Russia and Saudi Arabia and also Obama's United States simply said, we can't join that kind of crazy idea, you know? So it was put back into the drawer, unfortunately. But in my view, it would be the only idea of finally decarbonizing the world. So this, I believe, has to be put back on the agenda, international agenda. And I, of course, delighted hearing Jeff saying all the things he has said, which were a bit pessimistic. I think we can define the benefits from doing the right things instead of the penalties of doing the right things. This, however, is something, in a sense, new to political science and political practice as well. You know, I used to be member of parliament in Germany and saw the kind of mentality there. It was always, in a way, devastating. But as a human being, as an intellectual, if you wish, I think it is not impossible for humanity to learn, create a system of awards for the good things and penalties for the bad things. Essentially, this is the idea of an ecological tax reform. And you can also make equivalent kind of things for the COVID diseases, etc. But that's a different matter. So all in all, I'm not at the end of the day a pure pessimist, but a challenger. I want to have at least the intellectual community and the policy community to come up with developing reward and penalty systems that are giving us the right direction.
Perfect.
Thank you, Professor. Now, since so many things were oriented to the United Nations and basically speaking how we create some kind of global movement. Of course, what we are doing here is our small effort in NGIC as a platform for dialogue, which is a dialogue of like-minded people who would pass the message on and on. I think it's the right moment for Madam Espinosa to take the floor and give us from your UN experience or the thoughts on move from economy to human rights aspects, from environmental to human right aspects. And probably, I mean, this is way how from Madam Espinosa, I'll go to Mr. Foxman and then to Kateryna and further on to Susan. So.
And I apologize deeply to all dear friends. I am 24 minutes past when I was supposed to be at the other meeting, so I'm going to see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us,
Thanks a lot.
Jeffrey. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, do I see?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do. Great.
Oh, fantastic. First, of course, I would like to thank the Nizami Ganjavi Center for this extremely timely dialogue. And of course, greetings to all the distinguished panelists, including my friend Jeff, who had to unfortunately leave us. And I think that basically what we have learned from the speakers here, but also from reality, is that COVID-19 has posed serious challenges to our already frail democratic institutions and political systems. I think that the pandemic shocked the world in a moment of increasing political polarization and radicalization, and what I call a generalized lack of trust on governments and democracies. And I would like to briefly, address 4 issues just as headlines so we can perhaps further the discussion. The number 1 is the trust deficit in institutions and democratic systems. The number 2 is the critical importance of the state, of the need to strengthen the notion of the public. It is not evident. This spirit of selfishness, as Ernst was very clearly sharing with us before. The number 3 is the central role of local governments, as we have witnessed local governments as service providers, as spaces for democratic innovations. The municipal movement has made incredible strides to address this democratic deficit that we are living. And lastly, perhaps a quick reference to the importance of multilateralism, according to the question that Zlatko posed at the beginning. So I think that, the trust deficit in democratic systems and institutions, I think that you have all said it so clearly. And Jeff, the exacerbation of inequalities, of poverty, of unemployment, the lack of access to health services has been widening the trust deficit in our democratic institutions. And that has happened for many, many years. And I often cite the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs report saying that since the mid-60s, public trust in government and political institutions has been decreasing, especially in industrialized democracies. And a very recent, not that recent, but an OECD study found that 45% of citizens in its member countries trusted the government, less than half, and 56% trusted the judicial system. So these are not very good news. And a study of Latino Barometer in my own region in Latin America, it showed that since the 2010, citizens who have declared themselves indifferent to the type of political regime in their country went from 16% in 2010 to 29% in 2018. So these are truly not good news. And when we speak in Latin America, for example, the judiciary has 24% of credibility, government in general 22%, and political parties 13%. So we are in trouble. And I think that the lack of trust in democratic institutions has been worsened by the COVID pandemic. The Edelman Trust Barometer says that in 2020, there was an epidemic of misinformation, widespread mistrust on societal institutions and leaders around the world. So I think this is perhaps one of the toughest challenges that we face. And the question was about human rights. We have seen, I think that we heard several examples from Vaira, but what we have seen is that some governments around the world are making use of extraordinary measures that limit democratic freedoms. Lockdowns to increase control over citizens, using technologies and big data for surveillance. And this has posed what I call an unprecedented dilemma between collective security and health with civil liberties. And I think this is, a profound struggle. And I think that the fear of people because of contagion, because of the COVID, because of lack of jobs, etc., may provide a window of opportunity for some governments to strengthen surveillance and limit democratic freedoms on a permanent basis. And I think this needs, further reflection and analysis. Very quickly, the importance of the role of the state. We have learned that, to face a huge crisis, the provision of public goods and services, universal health coverage, it is central. There is no replacement, no philanthropic work, no goodwill, no voluntaristic decisions that can replace the role of the state as provider of public services. And you said it clearly, let's go back to the basics: universal health coverage, education, digital inclusion. These are the critical things that are going to boost legitimacy and credibility on our democratic institutions. And here we heard, this 1.9 trillion American rescue plan, because the US is a rich country. But let's look at what is happening with the low and middle income countries. So no 1.9 trillion at all. There is a great fiscal stress in these countries. This is going, of course, to make the inequalities and the lack of trust in institutions even deeper in the global south. And this is, of course, due to the fragility of health systems, inadequate social protection systems, fiscal stress, etc., etc., etc. And here, perhaps a little reference to the role of local governments, of cities as service providers and first responders. I think at this point, talking about governance, we need to rethink decentralization, innovation hubs for democracy at the local level as alternatives to centralized control and response. And finally, to close that, the motto of this pandemic has been, no one is safe until everybody's safe. But even that has proven, this is obvious, but it has proven to be ineffective. The lack of coordination, unilateral closure of borders, lack of shared protocols have had strong negative impacts, and this is not a secret. And a vivid example is what Jeff was saying, the lack of cooperation and the so-called vaccine nationalism. WHO last week said 42 countries had begun to deploy vaccines, 36 high-income countries, 6 middle-income countries, but no low-income countries yet. Most of the early supply of vaccines is flowing directly to the high-income countries. And few rich countries have pre-ordered about half of the existing global vaccine production. And these countries account only for 13% of the global population. Just let's think that in our part of the world, people in low-income countries might have to wait until 2023 or 2024 for vaccination. And this is unacceptable. And this is eroding the legitimacy and efficacy of the multilateral institution. So in sum, I think that we have witnessed a human rights tension, which is an old tension between social and economic rights, the need to open the economies versus civil and political rights. And this has been on the, so evident during the pandemic, and the struggle and tension between civil liberties and social discipline. The other issue has been problems with the access to basic services such as health, water, the issue of access to decent jobs in the midst of huge fiscal pressure for governments of the South. When we see these millionaire rescue packages, it hurts to see that from the whole European recovery package, 0.3 has been devoted to the developing world and to the global South. It is not enough. And what is clear is that it is not a lack of money. It is not a lack of resources. I think that the lack of money is a symptom, is not the problem. The problem is what Ernst has said, is selfishness, is greed, is not understanding that if everybody's safe, we are all much better off. And I think that the other issue we need to address when talking about human rights and governance issues and democracy is the information and communication pandemic. The world of the post-truth, the role of social media, how far we can go in regulating the media and social media in particular. Therefore, I think it is of critical importance that we boost the role of science, science-based decision-making, and science diplomacy. And just to close, I didn't have the time to talk a lot about the UN, but the importance of a strong, well-funded, authoritative multilateral system. The United Nations, the WHO is irreplaceable arm, to make sure that the world responds, in a good way through the incentives that Ernst was mentioning. We need a well-funded response to ensure that the recovery process, this reinvention process, is greener, is more equal, and is more peaceful and more democratic, of course. And I would just end by that, Zlatko, back to you, and thank you again.
Thank you, Maria, very much. Mr. Foxman, of course, I cannot. Of course, you have your prepared statement, I'm sure, but I would really very much be interested in your thoughts, among other things, having in mind that ADL, as it says, describe its ultimate goal as a world in which no group or individual suffer from bias, discrimination, or hate. End of quote. My question is very simple for you for the beginning, just to launch this your intervention. I mean, when we are looking about the world beyond the pandemic, are we now in better or worse conditions to go for that goal? And regardless of being in better or worse condition, what we should do to be walking stronger and faster and bolder in direction of, as ADL described its ultimate goal, as world in which no group or individual suffers from bias, discrimination, or hate. That would be also one very flexible and clear definition of what democracy is about. It's about human dignity and how much we are closer to it, how close or how far, and what we should do.
Well, even in better times, that goal was an aspiration, which sadly to say, I see much, much further away. And so I will give you my prepared remarks, which do impact on your question. I see the withering of democracy today, its biggest challenge being the weakening of the center in too many societies. The center is a result and a product of many factors. One, the polarization of politics, where each side sees the other as the enemy and are prone to conspiracy theories about the other. The second is changing demographics, particularly in the US, but it's also true of Europe, which frightens many on the right that they are losing their country, and is exacerbated by some on the left who move from liberal ideas about making society a just society, ideas of surrounding identity politics. In this environment, we're talking about globalism is a given. Globalism is wonderful. Globalism is a positive. But sadly, globalism was naively seen as a simple win. But it no longer is the answer that we see to many people around the world, because it ignores those who saw themselves losing because of globalism, because as Jeffrey and others have mentioned, because of it, it has made them susceptible to extreme politics. Then there's economic insecurity, with jobs disappearing from the old-fashioned manufacturing sector as a result of high-tech dominated economies. Those insecurities also feed nationalist ideas, some of which can be extreme. And then, of course, there is the internet, social media, which was a boom to us in communications, education, interaction. And then very quickly, there were unintended consequences of this great discovery. It has already destroyed privacy, and it's on its way to destroying civility. It has also provided a superhighway for the bigots, for the haters, for lies, and for disinformation. And so, despite these challenges, there are always ways to rebuild a reasonable center. Sadly, it takes courageous leaderships on both sides, the right and the left, who truly act on the belief that the restoration of society with an element of consensus is more important than any specific policy goal. This requires a willingness to compromise on deeply held beliefs, and we don't see it. It needs a willingness to see the other side as just having a different perspective and not being the enemy, and finding a balance with the values of globalism, national identities that remain. And so leadership is and will be the key to the answer. I know we've espoused all kinds of great responses and economics and equality. But if we don't have the leadership, we won't get there. And finally, permit me, on a personal note, as a longtime Jewish community leader, I must add that these trends that I have been speaking about raise particular concerns about hate and bigotry and anti-Semitism. These are things that are weakening the center, the polarization, and all the other issues. They are a perfect storm for prejudice, for hate. And what I tried in the last 50 years to attain, as you stated, makes it that much more difficult, because the atmosphere today, unfortunately, is very damaging to minorities and to all that which we hope to develop in terms of human rights. So thank you for the ability to share with you those few thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you, really. Thank you very much. And now when you ended with the words human rights, I think that even if it was not scheduled before, I think, Kateryna, I would have to call you to continue with your intervention.
Thank you. I agree completely with what Mr. Foxman just said. And I'd like to say that, like President Freiberga and Jeff Sachs, I feel that there's an increasingly ominous sense of fragility in the world today. And that's in terms of human rights, society, politics, economics, and health. It's been exacerbated by COVID, both the economic and social ramifications of COVID, but it's also due to an increasing polarization between and within countries. We sense a growing disillusionment with democracy and a turn away from freedom in search of authoritarian solutions toward order over insecurity that has come from the change of globalization, the effects of internet and social media. And I'd like to cite two studies. One, the University of Chicago, my alma mater, looked at increasing polarization within the United States. And it noted that while 50 years ago, there was a curve in the middle, and on the left and the right, there were, they would go to the extremes, but there were fewer people in the extremes and most people were in the middle. But over the 50 years, it's changed so that there is a curve on the left and a curve in the right, with very few people that are in the middle. And the people in both the curves have very little communication amongst themselves and very little understanding of the beliefs of the other. And that, I feel, is a very dangerous thing. Another study done by social scientists shows that approximately 18% of Americans are highly disposed to authoritarianism. Another 23% are just one step below the authoritarianism scale. Thus, what that means is that roughly 40% of Americans tend to favor authority, obedience, and uniformity over freedom and diversity. But I believe that this polarization has been intentionally fueled by numerous actors in the world, most notably by Russia, which deliberately seeks to sow chaos in Europe and in the United States. And though it's weak both economically and socially, the Russian Federation remains relevant because its determination to use all means to undermine stability in Western nations. And if you look at all the hotspots today in the world, whether we're talking about Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, and other places, you see Russian involvement. And we've seen that Putin is not adverse to using actual violence, war, and, for me personally, a difficult issue, poisoning, because he knows through experience that the world community is too divided and self-absorbed to respond adequately. Instead of acting resolutely, let alone forestalling aggression, Western governments constantly seek a reset, a quote, common ground. And further, the Kremlin has used the riches gained through state corruption to buy political elite across Europe. We need to look at Nord Stream 2 pipeline to see Western European leaders going against their country's national interests. But though obviously war and economic warfare count as massive violations on human rights, I'd like to highlight another human rights issue that has become a major challenge to societies today. And that's the rapid spread of disinformation propaganda through social media and communications platforms, and where information is used as a weapon. And I believe this endangers our human rights in several ways. First, it endangers democracy itself because it undermines free and fair elections. People need to hear the truth about their candidates, about their positions, but instead they are barraged with lies. Then they fall into information silos that only reinforce their misconceptions. And this leads to populism, radicalization. We've seen that in the US, in the UK, in Hungary, Brazil, and elsewhere. I'd like to cite some research done at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that discovered that falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter than facts. And true news stories take up to 6 times longer to reach people. Second, false information endangers health. Since the pandemic started, there have been massive campaigns against vaccines, lockdowns, masks, and in favor of untested treatments. Indeed, studies show that 40% of health news shared online is fake. And I've been subject to that as well. I have shared a few things that I found out later were not true, but I assumed originally that they were true because they were online. And Ukraine has been a victim of this for many years. I remember back in 2005, we had a barrage from Russia against vaccines in our country. Third, fake news violates our right to non-discrimination. Propaganda often focuses on certain groups in society, whether they be migrants, whether they be Jews, Arabs, or Mexicans, or others. And those spreading disinformation have often hidden behind the claim of, quote, free speech. But it seems to me that recently the world has come to be aware that there's a difference between free speech and fake news that undermines national security and democracy. So how do we deal with this fragility? And I think it's by creating greater resilience. First, strengthening institutions such as election processes, rule of law, fair media within countries. And this is particularly true of the US, which I strongly believe that for decades has been a role model for freedom. It's for peaceful transition through fair elections, strong institutions, and it inspired millions around the world. We saw that in the former Soviet Union. It was the inspiration for freedom. And the US must regain that moral authority that it once had. Its greatest power was not its economic and military strength, but its values, its principle, and its example. The second way to build resilience is to strengthen international cooperation, unity, and alliances. Free democratic nations around the world need to stop reacting unilaterally and weakly, and instead formulate a strong, unified strategy that promotes freedom, democracy around the globe, supports allies, and counters attempts to undermine freedom. Some, for example, Anne Applebaum, have suggested calling for an international summit of democracies, which we all hope would not only issue statements, but actually formulate and implement large projects to tackle important issues such as, and I'll end with my list of what I think these important issues are. First, preventing states from changing borders by force, how to deal decisively and multilaterally with those who have already changed borders. Second, how to deal with huge flows of illicit money and corruption. Third, cybersecurity, which I believe is a big danger to the world today. Fourth, false information and regulating the internet by coming together to ensure effective data protection, transparency, and independent fact-checking. Fifth, promoting human rights and liberties globally. Sixth, dealing with increasingly ominous environmental and health concerns. And so in summary, I want to argue that the world has become much too fragile, and we need to respond by building resilient institutions within and between countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Kateryna. And of course, Susan, I would like just to connect on what was said about leadership in changing world, I think by Mr. Foxman first, and also by Maria as well. Everyone is in waiting to see leadership. American leadership. We were all very enthusiastic about the changes in the White House. We were all very afraid and watching closely 6th of January. And now we see that the things are going in the right direction. We saw Joe Biden coming, visiting State Department and talking to Anthony Blinken and saying again what we said previously, America is back. We are back. We are back to the world stage. So my question is very simple. Susan, I think you are probably the right person in this panel to tell us a little bit about more. I mean, what we can expect, what we should do, what we should do in other parts of the world to welcome that and to be complementing, be on the same path. So, Susan, the screen is yours.
Well, thanks to everyone. I really appreciate all the things that I've heard today, and especially I would go back. It's something that Abe said, but it relates to what you just asked, Zlatko, is that the importance of strong leadership. And by strong leadership, I mean a leader who is willing to make decisions and to take risks, for the good of the whole. I'm cautiously optimistic that President Biden sees that and is trying to work on the things that he needs to do to strengthen the U.S. But I would go back to even what Kateryna just said. I think that we can't do this alone. So we need strong leaders from other like-minded countries, democracies, to work together. And I agree with the idea that, Kateryna just proposed about having a group of democracies come together to try to tackle these problems. Because I think what the pandemic did in the US was to exacerbate things that even Abe pointed out had already been there and made worse. And I think the disinformation, we can see in the US that disinformation, which half the population believed that our systems didn't work, is really is very troubling, to me. And so we need to heal within the US. And how do we convince people who are, I think Kateryna brought this up, who are on the two extremes now, that coming to the middle, as Abe pointed, is what we need. But coming to the middle, not only in the US, but around the world. So I would say, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think we need to reinvigorate our international organizations that we have and others, and we need to have a focus on human rights. I think that what Jeffrey said about, the inequalities in the US and around the world, in the US, they're great, but around the world, they're even greater. I think what Ernst said about selfishness is very evident. Because to me, in the US, this idea of social democracy was confused during our election with socialism. That somehow, if you believe in more healthcare and other things, that you're reverting to a country like China or others. So I really hope that we can come together and as like-minded, democracies to really strengthen and work together, because working separately is not an option. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think I'll leave it at that, because all the great points have already, been made. And I will say the one thing that several people have made, and President Freiberga, is, there were people from all walks of life who stormed our Capitol, but I think what they had in common is their thinking. They weren't an ethnically diverse group, and they're thinking that somehow they've been left out or they've been cheated. Was what encouraged them, to do what they did. So we need to work on disinformation. We need to work on, like-minded democracies coming together. And I'm going to stop because I've just gotten a notice that my battery on my computer is going to die. So I need to plug it in. So I'll stop, but happy to talk more in a few minutes. Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Susan. Bertie, you are online. You joined us. So you're going to take a screen now, and we hope that we'll hear some words about what we can expect now, having in mind that you're coming from, Ireland, but Ireland is always connected with the UK. UK was the European Union. Now we are in some kind of flux, and there are great expectations of everyone. What's going to happen, having in mind that dynamic. So, Bertie, of course, you're free to say what you were planning to, but I hope we will hear some words about this as well.
Yeah, definitely do that. Can I just say what Susan and Kateryna said? Sorry, I missed the start, but I think I very much agree with. There is great concern, I think, and great anxiety and fear that so many countries in the world seem to be getting just ambiguous about their democratic values, and so much change is not change for the positive. And I think there is an enormous necessity for us all to pull together. I think we've seen 4 or 5 years of a presidency in the United States that seem to pull away from multilateralism. I don't want to go back over the last 4 or 5 years, but we see the damage that can be done to the very organizations that are so important to us, the United Nations, to the European Union, to the World Health Organization, and to other treaties around the world. And we see what's happening, the friction that there was between China and the United States, and we see the friction within the European Union. And maybe I'll just address your question first before I say I want to just touch on 2 other issues. I think I always felt that Brexit and the United Kingdom leaving the European Union was a disaster. I worked hard in Northern Ireland in the 2016 campaign to try at least to make sure Northern Ireland wouldn't vote that way. They didn't. We're now seeing the outworkings of Brexit. It's bad for the European Union. I think it's bad for the United Kingdom, and particularly in a pandemic. But pandemics aside, it does break that relationship that was built up by almost half a century, where we had free trade, where we had a single market, incidentally, that was the brainchild and driven very much by Margaret Thatcher, by a British Tory who believed that this was the way to go, that this was the way that 20 countries, or 27 now, 28 if they were still there, would be able to work in a united way. Instead of that, we're now building up. What's happening at the moment is there's big problems at the ports. Importers are having big problems getting goods in. Exporters are finding the bureaucracy is enormous. So all of the things that many of us were saying would come to pass are coming to pass. And of course, there's not much good for any of us now. We don't want to be saying we told you so, because that gets us nowhere. But the sad thing is that all of this will affect employment. It affects cooperation. We had a big row between the European Union and Britain about the vaccine, about how the orders were being dealt with. So all of these difficulties are, and to answer your question, will continue to create unnecessary friction, unnecessary divisiveness. And I think those of us who care about administration and governance have to do our best to try and get people to work together. But it is unsettling, it is damaging, and there's no winner, there's no good news out of it. And all of that, I think leads in with what has been said by Susan, Kateryna, and others. The world today, in my view, and I read the interesting paper that was sent out. I thank the Institute for that. But we need multilateralism, and we need solidarity, and we need cooperation more than ever. And I think every choice that we make and every action that we take today will shape the world of tomorrow. And that's what we need to remember. So it's what we do now is for tomorrow. So I think we have to work together to build a community with a shared future for mankind, and stride forward on the right path of multilateralism and cooperation. And the pandemic has also revealed, I think, the best of humanity, and let's not ignore that. The heroic efforts by frontline workers all over the world to provide care and essential services to those directly affected, and the remarkable social cohesion and solidarity and civic responsibility of people throughout the world who have worked hard this last 12 months of restrictions and disruptions to lives and livelihoods. Can I just say about the what I find very extraordinary is about all the lockdowns and the restrictions on civil liberties, that many of the people of the left who normally complain about any breach of civil liberties seem to be crying out the loudest, that want everybody locked up and nobody can fly, and they seem to be making more noise. Normally these people, if you touch civil liberties, it'd be marching on a Saturday afternoon. And now they're the cheerleaders for lockdowns and close downs, which I find extraordinary, but maybe I'm getting old. The pandemic, but I think reminds us that multilateral responses to global challenges remain essential. And I think the reality is that we're interconnected, we're interdependent. Even the strongest of us cannot succeed alone. And those that think they can are finding out very harshly what the reality is. And this is, I think, the guiding spirit. And I just want to go back on the United Nations, which some speakers didn't get a time to go, and just say a few words, because we're just taking up our seat in the Security Council. And I think the same unwavering commitment to working together underpins what we said in our candidacy for the Europeans, for the United Nations Security Council. We're obviously glad to be members of the Security Council, but I think we're elected because members believe that we could make a contribution to the core mandate and the maintenance of international peace and security. And I think but it is sobering in the early papers that I've read in the last few weeks that since we last served on the Security Council 20 years ago, the number of issues in the Council agenda has trebled. So far from going in the right direction, violent conflict, insecurity, problems of one kind and another, as time doesn't allow me to run across the world, but they continue to grow. And I think we face enduring global challenges, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves. If time permitted, I could list off 20 of them, because I marked them on some documents I got from the Irish government. And hunger, food insecurity, the existential threat of climate change, violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, impunity for perpetrators. And in my view, and I continue to be an optimist, the Security Council can and must play a role in addressing them, because if they don't, who will? And I think we can be under no illusions that deep divisions exist in the Council, but we can't accept that these divisions mean that the Council can step back from its responsibilities and I think and fulfill the role entrusted it by the UN Charter and by member states. And as we join the Council as a small country with firm principles and clear priorities, these principles will underpin our approach of building peace, strengthening prevention and ensuring accountability. And these have to be at the heart of what we all. And I think we also need to become much better at linking peacekeeping, peace building, ensuring continued and sustained support for countries emerging from conflict, because there are so many of them. And particularly, as has been mentioned earlier, in the less developed countries who really suffer from the pandemic. And I think, in my view, we've had our own problems in Ireland that I've been central to for many, many decades, but peacekeeping is a vital task, and it saves lives, it prevents conflicts. And the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has frequently said we need durable solutions to the causes of conflict, and we have to build on that. The last point I just want to make, I think everybody at the moment is thinking of their own country and their own vaccines, and what percentage of people are vaccines and how many will be vaccinated. And I understand that, and we have it in my country too. But I do want to just re-echo what others have said. It is a fact now that in sub-Saharan Africa, that we have the real case that the figures aren't reliable. We don't really know what the number of cases or the number of deaths are. If you look at South Africa, where we kind of do, I think they've done a lot of testing. We have a good idea. So that shows the order of the problem. And if you look at the most optimistic countries in Africa, they're saying by the end of next year, the end of 2022, that they might reach 60%. And they are all underlying might. So the reality is most of them will probably not see 50. And that means 2023, 2024, this is going to suck. This is going to make it not only the pandemic, but the two big words that will keep on focusing as we go through this year for these less developed countries, and particularly Africa, not only, but is vaccinations and finance, because the issue of finance and rising debt and their budgets and their capacity to be able to deal with the pandemic will grow. This will pull down the growth rate. It will undo the good work that we have been doing in so many of these countries over the last 10 years. And now we see as the commodities market has declined, as China's got more stricter on the contracts. And the last point, and this is where those Western countries, if they want to look at the real difficulty, if they believe they're going to be able to open up the world and aviation and everything else, how are they going to do that if these countries are not going to be able to move around? And that's going to become the problem. It's not what people are focused on today as we're in the first quarter of 2021. But I'm sure as we're all here today, in a year's time, 18 months' time, countries will find that it is the kickback from these countries that are still not vaccinated, have financial problems, that we're going to be in great serious difficulties, not just for this year, but for the years immediately ahead. Again, thank you for allowing me to say those extra few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertie. Well, now I would ask Vaira, my dear President and co-chair of NGIC, as a first speaker of our today's discussion. If Vaira, you would like to, because we are obviously, I mean, discussions were so fruitful, and there are so many interesting, I mean, I repeat so many times our motto of NGIC: dialogue, tolerance, learning, and understanding. And I kept learning and learning more. I mean, since I've been using this NGIC platform in a variety of ways. And I have so many notes, I mean, here after these discussions, that I really feel that I learned a lot. And I think that I have much more understanding of certain issues as well. So really, without trying, of course, to make any comments on what I heard, I would ask you, Vaira, if you would take a screen, I mean, and do reflect on what we were having today, and please.
First of all, thank you very much to everybody who took the time to share their thoughts with us. The restrictions of travel that we have seen in the last calendar year mean that we save time from sitting in airports and in airplanes and so on, but that has been replaced by sitting in front of our screens. And I think it's typically of what happened to Jeff is we're very lucky. We're very lucky to have Jeff with us. We're very lucky to have you with us, because typically people who have something to say are being solicited from so many paths that they're constantly, well, they're not running around the world through this rather terrific technology, which we didn't have a few years ago. So in a way, it's a good thing that this technology, even if the people who are responsible for it are getting unduly rich, obscenely rich, at the cost of the pandemic, or benefiting from the pandemic, I think we should be grateful for the opportunity of being able to communicate information and not just disinformation on the public media. The thoughts that you have emphasized in various ways, I believe, are very congruent and very consistent among them. The importance of the economic factors in world development are undeniable, and the divergences within countries in terms of the growth of the Gini indexes, particularly in the richer countries, the lower limits in so many countries of poverty. We thought for a while that, for instance, with China lifting so many out of poverty, that we were reaching by 2030, we would be reaching the SDG goals. But these are statistics, and I think the conditions on the ground in many countries in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, frankly, if you look at the lowest layer of society, the conditions are still extremely dire, and particularly the conditions of children. I'm in one of the groups that UNESCO has set up, and this is about the future of education. Well, it's quite obvious that a large proportion of the world's children are still going to be deprived of the basic right to basic education. We're not talking PhDs and fancy liberal professions, but simply absolutely fundamental basic rights to literacy and numeracy, and access, of course, to modern media. The human rights aspect remains a crucial one. It's linked both to economic factors, because if you live in dire poverty, obviously you can't have access to education, to health, to lodgings. The conditions of isolation imposed by lockdowns in so many countries mean that domestic violence is exacerbated, even I think in families that normally would be free from it, something that might have been a quarrel in earlier days after 3 months of sitting one on top of another, locked down in a restricted space. I think violence arises where earlier it would not have done so. So the pandemic is having a very deleterious effect, both on the quality of life of children, of women, and of the poorer sectors of society. The aged are being decimated in many countries. The appalling conditions in various old age people's homes are simply horrifying, but also in various other, any institution is under heavy threat. So these are all parts of the basic rights that people have to live, develop, and die in dignity, and we're far from it, very far indeed. But what you all have emphasized is that we have, after all, achievements already. The fact that so many countries in the world who are members of the United Nations have shown in the last decades progress in both their economic status and in their ability to guarantee human rights to their citizens. There are many failed states in the world. I'm thinking concretely, for instance, of Central Western Africa, which has become, I think there are half a dozen countries which could be considered as absolutely failed states, where the state is unable, totally unable to provide. Also Central Africa. What we heard from our participants, what we expect from the state to be able, Maria Fernanda particularly emphasized this. We need states to guarantee humane and civilized conditions of life. Otherwise, it's worse than a jungle. Because human beings, frankly, can be, when their worst instincts are let loose, they're worse than I think, even the worst predators, who only kill when they're hungry, whereas humans kill for pleasure. So altogether, I think we need to continue the sort of activities that we're all engaged in. Support for the United Nations, support for the ideas that we have been subscribing to earlier. In the case of the Nizami Ganjavi Center, our network of collaborations with like-minded organizations, with like-minded individuals is crucial. Mr. Foxman, we're particularly pleased to see you, Professor Weizsacker as well. The Club de Rome, as pointed out, has a long record of achievements in the international sphere. We have Maria Fernanda from the United Nations, and Kateryna mentioning how closely, how personal the policies of some countries in using their power can touch us when we say that poisoning individuals is used as a tool of power. Kateryna and her husband know all too well what exactly that means in concrete reality. So we do have, I think, our work cut out for us. I thank you for all that you are doing, what you have done, and I wish you Godspeed, good health, and a lot of energy in continuing doing the good work that you have been doing. And Zlatko, thank you so much for chairing this session. Thank you so much. And Roshan, thank you for organizing it.
Well, Vaira, thank you. I mean, you wrap up everything and you close this, basically speaking, with really the very clear message of where we are. We have expression, in my part of the world, if there is a will, there is a way. And so obviously we do have a will of do make a better future for the world that we care about. And that's the reason why NGIC under your leadership is definitely a platform in which people will be showing the way, because we do have a will. And that's the reason why we can be more optimistic, as Bertie was talking about. And this morning I was reading one very interesting book of one British historian, Thomas Fuller, in a quote that he said something like, "The darkest hour of the night comes just before the dawn." So the thing that today looks so dark and green maybe is a good signal that dawn is on the horizon. So with that optimistic view, with Jeffrey, you always become a little bit pessimistic when we hear Jeffrey, his realistic opinions about where we are. But we should be a little bit more driven by our values and energetic passion to do something and be the best versions of ourselves, to go to the common goal, showing shared leadership, shared values, shared vision, and of course, being persistent in our defending our values. So thank you, Vaira, so much for actually closing this the way you did. And Rovshan, I know that everyone knows that you are someone who has to be thanked very much, because without your energy and your commitment to put all us together and glue us together with all this technology and make us being interested in learning from each other and understanding each other so much, I want to thank you again and thank for everyone. And as Susan said, I'm waving to all of you, and I'm so glad to hear.
Bertie, it was good to see you. Susan, bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for a great discussion. Pessimistic, but gives me optimism that things will get better.
As Kofi and I used to say, I'm a stubborn optimist, so we need to continue working. So thank you so much, Roshan, for bringing us together. Thank you so much. It's been a great
We need
discussion.
to fight for truth. Truth has been destroyed. We need to fight for truth.
That's true.